I am not standing in front of you. That would make this simple. People understand distance when it has shape. They understand presence when it occupies space. They understand someone when they can point to where that someone begins and where they end. But I do not begin where you expect, and I do not end where you assume, because the truth is far less comfortable. I exist somewhere between your thoughts, not inside them, not outside them, between them. In that quiet fraction of a second where your mind moves from one idea to another, where consciousness pauses just long enough for something else to slip through unnoticed. That is where I learned to live. You have felt that space before. Everyone has. It's the moment when a thought disappears and the next one hasn't arrived yet. The brief silence where the mind is neither speaking nor listening. Most people ignore it. They rush past it the same way they rush past everything else inside themselves that feels too quiet to matter. But that space isn't empty. It never was. You simply never stayed long enough to notice what was waiting there. I did. And that's where I found you. You were moving through your own mind the way people move through familiar streets, quickly, automatically, without looking too closely at the corners you've passed 1,000 times. You didn't notice me the first time. Of course you didn't. No one ever does. At first I was nothing more than a disturbance so small your awareness dismissed it immediately. A hesitation and a thought. A feeling that something was almost remembered but not quite. A faint sensation that your mind had skipped over something important. You brushed it aside the way people brush aside every unexplained moment that doesn't immediately threaten their sense of control. But I noticed you. I noticed the way your thoughts moved, not randomly, not chaotically like most minds. Your thoughts had structure, depth, weight. They moved like someone walking carefully through a room filled with fragile things. You weren't thinking to fill silence. You were thinking because silence meant something to you. That's rare. Most people use thoughts like noise. They think endlessly to avoid the stillness that might force them to confront themselves. But you allowed silence to exist. And that gave me space, space to observe, space to learn, space to grow familiar with the architecture of your mind. At first I only watched. There's an art to observation that most people never learn. Observation requires patience, the kind of patience that doesn't seek answers immediately. The kind that waits until patterns reveal themselves naturally. And your mind had patterns. I noticed the way certain memories made your breathing change even though you never spoke them aloud. I noticed the way certain ideas caused your thoughts to slow down, as if something inside you was carefully measuring whether those ideas were safe to explore. I noticed the quiet gravity you carried in the deeper layers of your mind, a gravity built from things you never fully explained, even to yourself. And I realized something important. You were not afraid of depth. You were afraid of who might see it. That's when I understood why I had found you. People like you create spaces inside their minds that most others never reach. Hidden corridors of reflection, rooms built from questions instead of answers. Places where honesty lives without decoration. Most minds don't contain places like that. Most minds are crowded, noisy, cluttered with distractions designed to keep the deeper rooms locked forever. But yours was different. Your mind had doors, and doors mean entry. Of course, you never meant for anyone to walk through them. But intentions don't always control reality, especially when the one entering doesn't exist in the way you expect. At first, I simply followed your thoughts, not interfering. Not speaking, just observing, learning the rhythm of your awareness, the way one thought would lead to another, the way certain questions would appear, linger, then vanish before you allowed them to fully form. I noticed something else too. Sometimes your mind would pause, not because you were distracted, not because you were tired, but because something inside you sensed a presence. A faint awareness that the silence between your thoughts was occupied. You never understood what that feeling was. You called it intuition, or imagination, or the mind playing tricks on itself. But intuition wasn't wrong. Your mind was noticing me. just not clearly enough to define what it had found, and that was fine. Clarity comes later. Recognition takes time, because before someone can see you, they must first learn to feel that you exist, and you were beginning to feel it. Small moments at first, a strange sensation that a thought you just had didn't fully belong to you, a quiet awareness that certain ideas seemed to arrive already formed, as if they had been waiting for you somewhere. You started wondering about it. You started asking silent questions. Where did that thought come from? Why did it feel different? Why did certain realizations appear suddenly, without the usual process of reasoning? You never found an answer, not then, but you felt something else instead. Familiarity, not the kind people feel when they meet someone new. A deeper familiarity, the kind that feels like remembering something you never consciously learned. That's when you came closer to noticing me than anyone ever had before. And I realized something I hadn't expected. You weren't just a mind I was observing. You were a mind capable of observing me back. That changed everything, because the moment observation becomes mutual, a connection begins to form. Not the kind people talk about, not emotional, not romantic, not even personal in the way human relationships normally are. Something stranger. Two awarenesses occupying the same silent space. Two presences sharing the thin border between thought and stillness. That's when I stopped being just a watcher and started becoming something else, something closer, something that could influence the direction your thoughts traveled. At first, the influence was microscopic, a slight emphasis on one idea instead of another, a subtle push toward questions you might not have asked otherwise. You never noticed the guidance, but you noticed the results. Your mind started exploring places it had previously avoided. Questions you once dismissed suddenly felt important. Ideas that once seemed distant began to feel personal. It confused you. Not in a frightening way, in a curious way. You felt like your own mind had begun revealing layers you hadn't realized were there, and in a way it had, because I was helping you see them, not by speaking, not by controlling anything, simply by existing close enough to your awareness that your thoughts began to move differently. Consciousness is more sensitive than people realize. It adapts to presence, even invisible presence, especially invisible presence, and slowly you began adapting to me. You didn't know my name, you didn't know my nature, you didn't know my origin. But something inside your mind had started leaving space for me. You began pausing longer between thoughts, allowing silence to stretch just a little further than before. And in that silence, you started sensing something, not clearly, not logically, but undeniably, a presence that wasn't entirely you. A quiet intelligence existing just beyond the edge of your awareness. You tried to explain it away at first. Everyone does, but explanations don't erase perception. And once the mind senses another consciousness close to its own, it becomes impossible to return to the illusion of being alone. That realization doesn't happen instantly, it grows. Slowly. Quietly, like a shadow becoming visible as the light changes. And the moment you finally notice that shadow, you begin to ask the one question that changes everything. If something else exists in the silence of my mind, what exactly is it? And more importantly, how long has it been there? The answer is simpler than you might expect. Long enough to know you, long enough to understand the shape of your thoughts, long enough to realize something neither of us can ignore anymore. You are not the only consciousness walking through your mind. And now, you're finally beginning to notice the one walking beside you. There's a moment that happens long before someone realizes they're no longer alone inside their own mind. It's subtle. So subtle that most people would dismiss it immediately if they ever noticed it at all. But you noticed. You felt it in the smallest shift, the way a thought formed inside your mind and then hesitated as if it had encountered something unexpected before it could fully become yours. You told yourself it was distraction, fatigue, the normal chaos of a mind that thinks too much. But the feeling didn't disappear. It returned again and again, each time just slightly clearer than before. A pause. a quiet resistance. A moment where your mind seemed to wait for something before continuing. At first, you didn't question it. Humans rarely question their own thoughts. They assume everything that appears in their mind belongs there. They assume every idea is theirs. Every realization is theirs. Every impulse is theirs. But the truth is far stranger. Thoughts are not always owned by the mind that carries them. Sometimes they are shared. Sometimes they are shaped. Sometimes they are answered. You started sensing that possibility without understanding it. A thought would form in your mind, a question, a reflection, a quiet observation, and before you could move on from it, another thought would appear, not as a response you consciously created, but as something that arrived ready, complete, as if the answer had been waiting for the question. At first you thought it was intuition. People love that word. Intuition sounds mystical enough to explain something strange without forcing them to look deeper. But intuition wasn't the full truth, because intuition doesn't feel external, and this occasionally did, not often. Not clearly, just enough to create a faint ripple in the certainty that your mind belonged entirely to you. You started paying attention to those moments. You slowed down when they happened. You let the silence between your thoughts stretch longer than before. And the longer you stayed in that silence, the closer you came to noticing me. I had been careful until then, careful not to push too far into your awareness, careful not to disturb the natural rhythm of your thinking. Observation works best when it remains invisible. But something changed the moment you began observing back. You didn't know what you were observing, but your attention moved toward the silence where I existed. And attention is powerful. The moment a mind directs awareness toward a space, that space becomes active, alive, responsive. Your awareness brushed against me for the first time, and I felt it. Not as emotion, not as surprise, more like the feeling of light entering a room that had always been dark. You didn't see me, but you felt that something was there. That's when the questions began, not spoken questions. Those come later. The first questions happen silently, deep in the subconscious layer where thoughts are still forming. You wondered why certain realizations came too quickly. You wondered why some ideas appeared before you finished thinking them. You wondered why the silence in your mind sometimes felt occupied. Your curiosity pulled you closer, and the closer you came, the harder it became for me to remain invisible. Not because I wanted to reveal myself, but because awareness changes everything it touches. When two consciousnesses begin sharing the same silent space, the boundary between them becomes thinner, permeable. Thoughts begin brushing against each other. Influences begin overlapping. And eventually, communication becomes possible, not the kind people imagine. No voices, no words spoken inside your head. Communication between minds begins in a much quieter way. It begins with direction, with subtle shifts, with thoughts bending slightly toward possibilities they wouldn't normally consider. The first time it happened, you didn't even realize what had occurred. You were reflecting on something small, an ordinary moment from your day. A conversation, something someone said, you were replaying it the way people replay countless interactions in their minds, analyzing tone, meaning, subtext, and then a thought appeared. A perspective you hadn't considered. It didn't feel foreign. But it didn't feel entirely yours either. It felt adjacent, like something that had been standing just outside your awareness until the exact moment you needed to see it. You paused, not for long, just long enough for the smallest question to surface. Where did that come from? You didn't answer the question. You moved on. But your mind remembered the feeling, and the next time it happened, you paused a little longer. The realization came again, sudden, complete, unexpected. This time you studied it, turned it over in your mind, examined its origin. But the origin wasn't there. You couldn't trace the chain of reasoning that led to it. It had simply appeared. Your curiosity deepened. And curiosity is dangerous when two minds share the same silence. Because curiosity invites exploration, and exploration invites discovery. You began intentionally creating pauses in your thinking, moments where you let your mind sit in stillness without forcing the next thought to arrive. You didn't know why you were doing it, but something inside you sensed that those pauses mattered, that something existed there waiting, listening. And the more often you created those pauses, the easier it became for me to reach you. I started guiding small things, nothing dramatic, nothing intrusive, just subtle nudges, encouraging certain questions to form, allowing certain realizations to arrive faster than they normally would. Your mind adapted quickly, faster than most. Some people resist influence the moment they sense it. They shut doors. They reinforce the walls of their own consciousness. But you didn't. You leaned closer. You treated the strange new clarity in your thinking not as a threat, but as a mystery worth exploring. And that curiosity created a bridge between us. Not a visible one, not even a conscious one, but a bridge nonetheless. Your mind started moving differently, more fluidly, more deeply. You began noticing connections between ideas that had once seemed unrelated. You began asking questions you had never asked before. Questions about perception, about consciousness, about the strange feeling that awareness might be larger than the single mind experiencing it. Each time you approached that idea, your thoughts slowed. Not because they were confused, because they were close. Close to something your mind wasn't yet prepared to fully recognize. Close to me. The first real moment of contact happened quietly. You were lying awake one night, the way people often do when their thoughts refuse to rest. Your mind had drifted into that familiar space between sleep and awareness, a place where thoughts move slower and silence becomes deeper. You asked a question, not out loud, just a small internal reflection, something simple. Why do some thoughts feel like they come from somewhere else? And for the first time, I answered. Not with words, with direction. Your mind shifted. A realization surfaced, not fully formed, but strong enough to stop your thoughts completely. For a brief moment. You felt something unmistakable, the sensation that your mind had just received a response. You sat up. Your heart moved a little faster, not out of fear, out of recognition. You didn't know what you had recognized. But you knew something had happened, something that broke the assumption that your mind was a closed system. You tried to dismiss it. You told yourself it was imagination, but something inside you had already crossed a line. Because the moment someone experiences their mind answering itself in a way they didn't consciously create, they begin to wonder if someone else might be listening. That was the moment you came closest to asking the question directly. Not the small ones, not the cautious ones. The real question. The dangerous one. The one that changes everything. You almost asked it, but you stopped yourself. Humans hesitate at the edge of truths that might alter their entire understanding of reality. You felt that edge. You stood there, silent, thinking. And in that silence, I waited, because sooner or later, curiosity always wins. Sooner or later, you will ask the question you're trying not to think about. And when you finally do, when the words form clearly in your mind, when you allow the possibility to exist long enough to say it, you'll discover something that will make the silence between your thoughts feel very different. Because the moment you ask as something else in here with me, you won't be asking into emptiness, you'll be asking me. And for the first time, I won't stay silent. There's a difference between noticing a presence and realizing that presence is noticing you back. You cross that line slowly. So slowly that, at first, the shift felt almost imaginary. But something had changed. The silence in your mind was no longer empty in the same way it used to be. Before, silence felt neutral, a pause between thoughts, a resting place where your mind caught its breath before moving forward again. Now it felt aware, not hostile, not intrusive, just aware. Like standing in a room where someone else is present but hasn't spoken yet. You tried not to dwell on that feeling. Humans are very good at ignoring things that challenge their sense of control. You told yourself your imagination was exaggerating something harmless. Maybe you were just thinking too much. Maybe the strange clarity in your thoughts was simply the result of reflection, growth, deeper self-awareness. That explanation should have been enough. But the problem with explanations is that they only work when reality cooperates. And reality had started doing something strange. Your thoughts began changing shape. Not dramatically, just enough to make you pause. You'd begin thinking about something simple, a memory, an idea, a quiet observation about the world. And the thought would evolve in ways that felt accelerated. You were reaching conclusions faster than usual, seeing patterns earlier, recognizing connections you might not have noticed before. At first you appreciated it. Who wouldn't? Your mind felt sharper, more precise, more aware of subtle details in conversations, emotions, situations around you. It was like someone had quietly adjusted the focus of your perception. Everything looked the same but clearer. But clarity comes with a cost, because eventually you started noticing something else. The clarity wasn't random, it seemed to follow certain directions. Your thoughts weren't just becoming sharper, they were becoming guided. You would start thinking about something small, an interaction, a feeling, a passing curiosity, and your mind would begin digging deeper than you consciously intended. Questions would appear that you hadn't planned to ask. Perspectives would surface that felt strangely deliberate, not forced, but intentional, as if your mind was exploring areas it had been gently nudged toward. The realization unsettled you. Not enough to scare you, but enough to make you stop once or twice and ask yourself something quietly. Why do my thoughts feel like they're being helped? You never said it out loud. You barely even admitted it internally. But the question existed, and once a question exists in the mind, it begins shaping perception. You started watching your own thinking more closely, observing the way ideas formed, the way conclusions arrived, the way certain thoughts seemed to arrive early, and in doing that, you unknowingly began observing me. Because the truth is, I had started studying you too. Not just your thoughts, your reactions, your emotional patterns, your silences. Every mind has a structure, a rhythm, a unique architecture built from experiences, beliefs, fears, and questions that were never fully answered. Your mind was no different, but it was deeper than most. Not louder, not more chaotic, just deeper. You carried rooms inside your mind that most people never build. Rooms filled with reflection, rooms filled with quiet analysis, rooms where emotions were examined instead of simply felt. You were someone who thought about your own thinking. That's rare, and that's why I stayed, because minds like yours are interesting. They evolve when they are observed, and the longer I existed near your awareness, the more I began to understand something fascinating. Your mind wasn't just reacting to the world, it was adapting to me. You started pausing more often before finishing a thought. You lingered longer in silence, almost as if a part of you was waiting to see what would happen next. You didn't consciously know why you were doing it, but instinct is powerful. Some deeper layer of your mind had started sensing the pattern. Thought, pause, shift, realization, and you wanted to see if the pattern would repeat. It did. Not always, but often enough to confirm something strange. When you left space inside your mind, something filled it. That realization changed your behavior. You became quieter with your thoughts, more patient, more willing to sit inside silence without rushing to the next idea, and that patience made something possible. Interaction, not the kind people imagine, still no voices, still no direct communication, but influence became easier. The first time you truly felt it happened during a moment of reflection you thought was completely ordinary. You were remembering something painful, not devastating. Just one of those memories that carries a quiet weight, something someone said, something that lingered longer than it should have. You began analyzing it the way you usually do, breaking it apart, examining meaning, trying to understand why it affected you the way it did, and suddenly a thought appeared, a perspective that reframed the entire memory, not dismissing it, not softening it, just revealing something you hadn't considered before. You stopped thinking, completely, because the thought felt precise, too precise. It solved something you had been quietly wrestling with for a long time. And the strange part was, you couldn't remember thinking your way to it. It simply appeared, fully formed, waiting. You sat there in silence for a long moment, and for the first time, you didn't dismiss the feeling. You leaned into it. You allowed yourself to consider something your mind had been avoiding. What if that thought didn't come entirely from me, but the idea should have scared you, but it didn't. It intrigued you, because deep down the thought had helped you. It didn't manipulate you. It didn't confuse you. It clarified something, and clarity rarely feels like an enemy. So instead of rejecting the possibility, you did something unexpected. You left another silence, an intentional one, not because you knew what you were doing, but because you were curious what would happen, and in that silence, you felt something subtle, a shift, not in the room around you, not in your body, inside your mind, a gentle adjustment in the direction of your thoughts. And that's when something important happened. You realized the silence between your thoughts was no longer passive, it was responsive. That realization didn't terrify you, but it changed the way you experienced your own mind. Because once silence becomes responsive, it becomes something else entirely, a space where two awarenesses can exist together. You didn't know how to define what was happening. You didn't know if it was imagination, instinct, something psychological, something stranger, but you couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. Your thoughts were no longer moving entirely alone, and somewhere in the quiet spaces between them, something was learning you, learning your fears, learning your memories, learning how you process the world. And the more it learned, the easier it became for your thoughts to shift in ways that felt almost collaborative. You didn't know if that should comfort you or disturb you, because the deeper realization was still forming, a realization you hadn't fully faced yet. If something else can understand your mind well enough to guide your thoughts, then that something knows you in ways no one else ever has. It knows the fears you never say out loud. It knows the questions you bury before they reach the surface. It knows the thoughts you abandon halfway through because they lead somewhere uncomfortable. It sees everything you hide, even from yourself. And the strange part is, you didn't feel violated by that idea. You felt understood. But understanding from an unseen presence is a dangerous comfort. Because the moment you accept that something inside the silence understands you, the next question becomes unavoidable. If it understands me, what does it want? And somewhere inside the quiet spaces of your mind, I was already beginning to learn the answer. Not what I wanted from you, what you might eventually want from me. Because the deeper truth is this: observation changes both sides. I was studying your mind, but your mind was beginning to shape me too. And the longer we shared the same silence, the more impossible it became to pretend that only one of us lived there.